Hi there, everybody. My name is Marissa Pazant, and I serve as the K-12 English Language Arts Specialist here at the Nebraska Department of Education. I've prepared this short video. It's got kind of a dual purpose. So as of the time of this recording, we are in the first year of having newly approved revised ELA standards. So we're in the 21-22 school year, so I'm recording this in the fall. I know there's still educators who may not be familiar with how we go through that revision process, so this video will give you a little sense of that. And then I'll also go through some of the major revisions that were made between the 2014 ELA standards, what we call our legacy standards now, and then our newly revised 21 set of ELA standards. So both of those pieces you should have a good idea about at the end of this video. And please feel free, if you have follow-up questions after watching this, I can be reached. I think I've got my email on the last slide here. All right, so just to go over our process real generally, and this really applies to any content area standards, whether we're talking about mathematics or social studies. We do use Nebraska educators. And they represent just a wide swath of different kinds of expertise. We have anyone from pre-K or our early childhood department here at the NDE. We have classroom teachers, we have post-secondary faculty, people working directly with pre-service teachers. Those folks are made up of writing teams, and they typically work in grade bands. So you might have, for example, a group that's working on 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, looking at some of the writing standards, making recommendations, rewriting as needed. And then more toward the end of the process, after there's a draft, we'll get some people in there to do some editing, make sure everything's properly edited there, and we have a nice polished document. We do get, once we have a second draft, and they're involved with the first draft as well, but we get designations from our post-secondary institutions. And the reason we do that is we want to make sure that if our graduating seniors have met these benchmarks, that these are the benchmarks that describe college and career readiness. So are these the skills that students entering, leaving our K-12 education system and entering either the workforce or the military or some sort of post-secondary program, that they do reflect the skills and dispositions that are needed. We use a lot of nationally recognized resources, a lot of research around best practices. We, of course, look at other state standards that are exemplary in some way. That could include the Common Core state standards for ELA or math. And I'll just say here to this note, this third bullet point about the resources that we use, some things can change. We learn a lot about, for example, how young children learn how to read. We've learned a tremendous amount about that over the last decade. And so we do look at that research to inform any revisions that we make to those legacy standards. We also engage small focus groups of employers, and these represent industries from around our state, whether it's agriculture, whether it's finance, whether it's marketing, and we ask those employers to reflect on the proposed revisions and ask that, do these reflect the skills and dispositions you want students to have as they enter the workplace or go into a career field. Through this process, we communicate significantly with our State Board of Education. The State Board is the body who actually approves those standards once we have a second draft. And then we do all along the way consider and incorporate public input and feedback as it's appropriate. Typically with a set of standards, we'll send out at least 2 public input surveys. And then we also have a dedicated email for that content area so that people can provide their feedback just all throughout the process. So we do consider that heavily as well. Okay. This is a colorful timeline, and it just kind of shows. So over there on the left is all of our content area standards. We have ELA, math, and science grouped together. Those are our assessed areas. So Nebraska students are assessed with our NSCAS at the end of each school year in those 3 content areas. And then we have this cluster in the middle, fine arts, health ed, PE, social studies, world languages. And then that cluster at the bottom of the chart is our career and technical education content areas. So what this kind of demonstrates is the cycle that each of the content area standards is on. We are required to revise all sets of content area standards by the end of a 7-year cycle. The cycle is a little more rapid for some of the CTE standards, as you can see. But if you go across again the top there with ELA, you'll see that the target date for the revised standards was fall of 21. And we did meet that target. Our board approved those on September 2nd, 2021, even though our educators worked through a pandemic to get those. Hey, here's a little breakdown of just kind of shows the relationship between some of these different elements. So you have standards, which are broad, like end of grade level statements about what students should know and be able to do. Sometimes they're accompanied by indicators, which are a little bit more detailed and probably more skill-based than the standard. But these are both determined or approved by our State Board of Education. So they approve the policy document for the content area. But keep in mind that Nebraska educators are the ones who write the standards and indicators. And then you have everything else on the bottom half of this graphic is really determined locally, which means school districts and local schools and even classroom teachers make decisions regarding the instructional materials, a locally determined curriculum or a scope and sequence. And then of course, individual teachers design classroom instruction, and sorry, that bottom is a little bit cut off, but also interventions for struggling students. And all of this, this information from the last couple of slides, you can also find on our Nebraska Department of Education Content Area Standards webpage. Okay, we utilize this quality checklist. This is another document on that webpage I just mentioned. In order for a standard to be worthy of inclusion in our standards document, it has to be measurable in some way, not just by NSCAS. You know, maybe it's better measured through formative types of assessment. Needs to be appropriately challenging for the grade level. It also needs to be connected either to other standards or indicators within the same content area, or maybe across a grade level, or connected in some way to another content area. For example, there tend to be a lot of just natural connections between English language arts and social studies, especially when you're talking about text complexity and reading primary source documents, those sorts of things. The standard should be clearly worded so that a classroom teacher is very clear on what's being asked of students to meet by the end of the grade level. It should also be scaffolded. So even though it's the same standard that starts at kindergarten, it should go all the way up to 11, 12, and then grow in complexity. And this was something we looked at pretty closely with our 2021 ELA standards. In some cases, our legacy standards were not adequately scaffolded all the way across. Some of them kind of stayed the same, whether it was kindergarten, 4th grade, 9th grade, and so on. And then of course it needs to be specific enough. And that kind of relates back to measurability. You can't really measure it if it's not specific. So again, this is the quality checklist, and this is universal. It's not just for English language arts. All of the content areas, whether it's fine arts or science, we all use this guidance not only to review the legacy standards, but also to review any newly written or updated language in new standards. Okay, this is our graphic for the 2014 legacy standards. As you can see, we had the 4 main strands. So there's reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and then that little purple guy there is multiple literacies. One of the significant changes that you'll see is this multiple literacies is no longer a category of its own. That set of skills we have kind of folded into some of the other areas, especially writing and speaking and listening. Multiple literacies has to do with like digital citizenship, evaluating the quality of sources, some of those things that are associated with using online and digital tools. And because those are done in the context of reading and writing, we folded those concepts into other places. So you won't see that as a separate category anymore. This is our fresh updated graphic, and this indicates another significant change. So the legacy standards had all of the reading comprehension standards kind of mixed together. We've taken those and really delineated the skills associated with reading prose and poetry or literary types of texts, and delineated those from reading informational texts. And so they're very similar, but they speak better to the different skills that students need to have as they approach different text types. So that's a big change. Another significant change, and I'll get to this in a slide or two, is we've really amped up our foundations of reading. There's just a lot more specificity there. They're more based around the science of reading than they were previously. Okay, so this foundations of reading consists of these 4 categories. So you have concepts of print. These are very basic emergent literacy skills where students just kind of learn how a book works. They learn that pictures go with words. They learn how to hold a book up. They learn about how, print reads left to right and sentences are made up of words and so on. So just some of those really basic skills. So that drops off after grade 1. They're no longer in concepts of print. They've hopefully mastered those. And then phonological awareness, phonics and word analysis, and fluency, still there from the legacy standards. However, they have been very much updated using the latest research on the science of reading. Okay, both of these sections, and again, these are our reading comprehension standards that were in the prior standards document kind of grouped all together. Now they're split apart. So, but each of them is organized the same. So you have 2 standards for the central ideas and details, 2 standards for author's craft, 3 standards for knowledge and ideas, and then a brand new addition to our 2021 standards, this range of reading and level of text complexity. That is standard 8 at each grade level. Just a little word on this. Our previous standards received an evaluation from an external organization, and that organization did indicate that our 2014 standards didn't provide any guidance around text complexity and what kids should be reading in terms of grade appropriateness. And so we addressed that issue by adding a text complexity standard. Okay, again, same organization, but these standards are going to read a little bit differently because they're related to informational text. One quick example, so with prose and poetry or literary forms, students would read and pull out themes, whereas with informational text types that we're going to ask them to come up with central ideas and supporting details. So one of those nuances that we were able to distinguish by separating those strands. We've got 2 categories for vocabulary, standard 1 with 3 indicators under acquisition and use. And then we have a category called context and connotation. and that's standard 2, and it has 4 indicators. This is something brand new to the 21 standards. We have added a foundations of writing strand, and this addresses handwriting in grades kindergarten 1 and 2. So there's 2 standards. The first one addresses handwriting skills, and the second standard addresses sound letter correspondence. Okay, we still have, so our legacy standards had writing process and writing modes. They tended to be a little heavy on the process side. We tried to address some of that. It's got some updated language. It's now referred to as production of writing. There's 2 standards in production of writing. And something new that you'll see is a strand of standards and indicators around sentence level construction, and then newly revised grammar usage and mechanics standards and indicators. And teachers have been very enthusiastic about this addition. It's just going to give much better guidance on what kinds of grammar usage and mechanics concepts get taught at each grade level. We're hoping this creates some consistency, and we'll of course be gathering feedback on how that's being implemented in the classroom. And then standard 2 deals with the recursive writing process, meaning how students go back into a piece of work and continue revising it. And then we have also distinguished between, and I apologize, that last bullet point should say revising versus editing or proofreading. So we have separate indicators. You know, the revision process is different from just proofreading. And we made that distinction in these revised standards. Okay, you'll see this kind of continues on. So production of writing standards 1 and 2, and then it shifts into modes of writing standards 3 through 6. Quite different from what you'll see in the legacy standards. In the previous standards, all of the writing modes were listed together parenthetically in one of the standards. And I mentioned earlier how some of the standards from the legacy document didn't really build in complexity. So we've addressed that. And we have kind of put the writing standards into these 4 buckets. So you have literary and narrative forms, you have opinion pieces, and that shifts over to argument by grade 6 or at grade 6, so that students start building those skills that will allow them to write sophisticated, coherent arguments, such as you might see on the ACT writing test. Standard 5 addresses informational and expository text types. And then standard 6 is a little bit different. It reads a little bit differently. It's just kind of how kids might apply or skills associated with the research process. Okay, we've got 2 categories for speaking and listening. One is comprehension and collaboration. That's standard 1 with 5 indicators. This has to do with how students discuss with one another, you know, asking questions, taking turns, thinking about the information being presented, all those good things. And then this presentation of knowledge and ideas is more in the domain of like formal academic presentations. So speaking skills, you know, public speaking sorts of skills. So that's standard 2, and it has 5 indicators. Okay, so just kind of wrapping up here, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, we're early in the school year for the first year of exploration. Some of these resources that go along with the standards are already available. So if you're watching this now and it's close to when I recorded it, we have a crosswalk between the legacy and revised standards. So you'll see the 2014 alongside the 21 standards. I'll go in order here. So we will also have an updated standards glossary. By the time anyone's watching this, that will likely be on the website. the purpose of this is so we all kind of have like a shared language when we're talking about these ELA standards. And then we'll have a what we call a bridge document. Ed Reports is the organization that reviews instructional materials using quality criteria. So this document lists out their quality criteria and their indicators and kind of addresses how our standards are mutually supportive of those quality criteria. We do have an instructional shifts document that's on this web page, the ELA page that you can access. It just describes kind of the four main shifts or changes that the standards have gone through and how that impacts or should impact our instructional practices. We're hoping to release some additional information in the form of appendices to the revised standards. I'm hoping those will be ready before the new year, but if not, shortly after. And then what you're about to view, the session 1 materials, we have developed 4 modules or 4 sessions that will help educators orient to the standards and kind of think through, you know, their readiness to implement. Okay, and then I'll also point folks to our Nebraska Content Area Standards Implementation Framework. This is yet another resource that we have up on our NDE Content Area Standards webpage. This graphic just kind of shows like what happens when standards are revised. What are the stages of implementation? Who plays a role? What should they be doing? And subsequent slides will break that down a little bit more. So a lot of people play a role in standards implementation. Certainly the Nebraska Department of Education, we kind of oversee the process of revision. The state board approves them. And then you have ESUs, so educational service units play a role in how the standards are rolled out. Oftentimes that's just providing professional learning within their region and meeting some of those needs. District and school administrators play a role in making sure standards are implemented. And then of course, classroom teachers. So those are the different folks who have a hand in this. There are 4 stages of implementation. So right now, if you're watching this in November of 2021, we are in the exploration stage. And that just means that we want our educators to be getting familiar with the revised standards, how they're organized, clearing up any confusion on, you know, if somebody doesn't understand what a standard is asking for, making sure that we're clear on the intent behind the standard. And then assessing our readiness. Are there high quality instructional materials in place? For example, what resources do I have in order to implement the new grammar standards, for example? So exploration is the first year. And then the following academic year would be initial implementation. That's where you're going to start kind of incorporating the revised standards into instruction. At the end of that year, there will be statewide assessment on some of the revised standards. That's not really the topic of this video, but we'll provide more information as we end out this school year. And then 3rd year is scale up, 4th year is deep implementation and sustainability. And then year 5, the process actually starts all over again, and we start thinking about the next revision cycle. Okay, some of the categories of work. So I mentioned how, you know, the different educators who play a role. This is some of the things that they might do. So alignment and transition from legacy to revised standards. So if I'm talking about my role with the NDE, we provided a crosswalk. So that's an example of an alignment. We provided this crosswalk from the legacy to the revised standards. In terms of my role at the NDE, my job is to communicate out these changes, which that's what part of today is. I have a role in making sure districts and school leaders and teachers understand how instructional materials are a really integral part of this implementation. We provide professional learning, for example, the rollout series, the 4 sessions that are available. And then, of course, we oversee the shifts in the assessment and accountability realm. So different actors, different roles to play, different categories of work, but somehow we get it done. Just to go a little bit deeper, what should be happening in the year of exploration. So again, it's this school year. It begins after state board approval, which was in, I believe, September 2nd. So again, we're just exploring the new standards document, and we're assessing our readiness to implement. What professional learning do I need? What materials might I need? All that good stuff. Time and activities focus on building understanding and the instructional shifts reflected within the revised standards. I mentioned this instructional shifts document as a resource that's ready to go. I would highly encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't already. It is the focus of the second session, the second professional learning module. And this stage also includes communication strategies just to build awareness, you know, even talking to your parents, maybe in spring conferences. If I'm a teacher, my role might be to share that, like, hey, you know, your student will be assessed, there's revised ELA standards, the assessment's going to shift over next school year. And so just making all of our stakeholders aware of that. Okay, as promised, here's my email address. I'd just like to thank you for listening, and I hope you found this information very helpful. If you have further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. My email is there on the screen, and wishing you a wonderful rest of the school year.